My name is Naomi Harris, and I'm the content manager of the Education Writers Association. We're so excited to welcome everyone here today to discuss debates over free speech on college campuses amid the ongoing Israel-Hamas war, how journalism students are covering these issues, and how all reporters can best cover this complex story. This is a very difficult topic for many people, and our goal is to have an open and professional conversation about these issues to help reporters best inform the public. I want to thank our professors, Jennifer Thomas, Mei-Ling Hopgood, and Roy Gutterman, along with our moderator, Kaylee Skinner, managing editor of Open Campus, for volunteering their time and expertise so EOWA could focus on this critical topic for our members. Lastly, I want to remind everyone that this discussion is on the record and that this webinar will be recorded. With that, I will turn things over to Kaylee.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. We are going to have a really interesting conversation, and I'll kick it off by just introducing our panelists. We have Mei-Ling Hopgood, who's a William F. Thomas professor at the Medill School at Northwestern, Jennifer Thomas, an assistant professor in the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film at Howard University, and Roy Gutterman, who's director of the Newhouse School's Tully Center for Free Speech at Syracuse University. Free speech on college campuses could really be its own beat these days. If you're watching this webinar, I'm guessing it's likely because you're interested in hearing a new perspective on what's going on college campuses in the light of student protests, activism, but so much news about what's going on and what people can and can't say. I have some questions I'm going to be asking our panelists for the majority of this, but there will be time at the end to ask questions in the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll be able to get to those. But I just want to kick it off by asking each of you to just really quickly talk about what is it actually like on your college campuses right now? What kinds of conversations are you having in your classroom?
Well, I'm happy to start. And I want to say thank you for having me here. It's Jennifer Thomas, Associate Professor of Journalism at Howard University. And so this war, Israeli-Hamas war, has launched a lot of conversations on our college campus. We are a historically Black college and university. However, I want to note that this is really not the first time that our students have been involved in covering conflict. So I think what's important, I would just say a couple of key factors that I use personally within the classroom and also serving as an advisor to our Howard University Association of Black Journalists, is that when we cover conflict, I think one thing that I like to do is use my personal experiences. And I think that's what's unique about those of us who are journalists by trade, that we can make that part of our pedagogy. And one quote that I often use is that the best part of education is that we can get experience out of ideas. So I recall covering things such as the LA riots with Rodney King and even the O.J. Simpson verdict. These were great polarizing events for parts of the country. And I share candidly about what those experiences were like for me as a young journalist and what conversations we were having within our own newsrooms and how I had to search within myself to find ways to make sure that and my background is as a video producer, a news producer, how I went around and went about covering the story using the First Amendment, but also just trying to separate my personal feelings from reporting the story. And I think we see that now, especially with our Gen Z generation, that is an issue sometimes because they're so incredibly involved in the story and have personal feelings. So in class, one of the things that I also concentrate on is going over the point that journalists and journalism should be based in fact. We should be fair, accurately, clear, and truthful in our reporting. And I think if we start from that as the common denominator, it makes it a little easier for them to report and not put themselves in the story. We let those involved, those who are attending the protests, we let them give their side, but then we try to stick with what the facts are. So there's much more to say, but I'll let the other panelists join in on that.
Mei-Ling, what about you? I know Northwestern has, you have plenty, we could have our own panel about what's going on over there.
I would second what Professor Thomas said, that we've been really having very intense and important conversations about difference and journalism and our practices dating back, I mean, since I've been there for sure, but when President Trump was elected, COVID, and on out, right? We know that it's just been a constant conversation. And I guess one of the things that happens in the classroom now that I would add that it's very much similar in my thinking about it is that we like to set an environment in our classrooms and set up conversations in ways that try to facilitate trust and engagement in a way that we older people probably wouldn't recognize at where we're setting the table when students come in to have hard conversations and very carefully as a class or as a cohort, but also in each class. And that is such an important stage setter for any kind of editorial decisions, classroom decisions, and engagement with activists and journalists. The other thing I'd add is that, these students are part of a community and they are trying to figure out what their voices, what journalism is to them, because many of the people that come to, I think, journalism school want to change the world, and they have definitely a viewpoint about stuff, and they have a different idea of what journalism should be, both in practice and in theory. So I can talk more about that, but please, other panelists.
I'm in kind of an interesting position on this issue because I teach a class all about free speech. I teach communications law, which is required for all our students, both undergraduates and masters. It's a senior level capstone class, and it's all about the First Amendment and free speech. And interestingly, this issue hasn't really come up too often in my classes. And I can attribute that possibly to the nature of the students we have in this class. They're seniors who are looking to be journalists or reporters or filmmakers or PR people with a professional bent. And their primary interest is, well, can I do this or can I not do this? Can I get in trouble? Can I be held liable? Can I get sued? That sort of stuff. That being said, if you go across the street to some of the more traditional university classes, religion, history, poli-sci, international relations, African American studies, I know this has been an issue that's been dominating class discussions, emotional class discussions from what I've been hearing. So, I think the venue and the nature of the class really informs the discussion. Training journalists to go cover these issues. I think many of our students understand that they have to take an arm's length approach to these hot button issues, even if it's a extremely personal and emotional issue. And I know we have students that have those connections to the issue. And perhaps the discussion's a little different in the lower level classes, the undergraduate program. I'm sure some of my colleagues who teach reporting or advanced reporting or intermediate reporting are dealing with this from time to time. But interestingly, in a class about free speech, I haven't really had to wrestle with this.
That's really interesting because that leads into a question I had, which is there is a lot of good reporting going on about what it is like to be on a college campus right now and how colleges are reckoning with students finding their voices on this issue. But what do you think the media is getting right about campus climate? Because you would think by some of the stories I read that this is just like consuming every waking moment of students' days, protesting and organizing. But that I'm going to guess is not the case.
Well, I can continue since I just started. Well, our university hasn't shut down. It's not like the 60s. Where protests shut down many or most university campuses, but it's in the background. It's in the backdrop. I hosted an event yesterday, and I was bracing for potential disruption. And luckily, it didn't happen. But I think we've been facing that potential, but not just on this issue over the last decade or so, but most hot button political issues. But you know, I think many campuses now have students who are very professional and goal oriented. And as much as this is a major global political issue, they still have to go to class. They still want to have good grades, and they still want to graduate and get a job or go to a really good graduate school. And political activism is just one more element to their lives.
And I would just add with that, being that we're in the nation's capital, our students are covering protest all the time, and most of the time not on campus, so they may be at the Supreme Court or outside of Capitol Hill or outside of the White House. So this becomes part of the norm, and it's a great experience for them of reality of what it's like, and they're unique in that they're able to cover it from that unique lens. But to your question about how the media is covering what's happening on college campuses, I think sometimes the larger media in general slips up because it's just like with any other story. You're in and you're out. You run, you get the story, you interview a few people, and then you report it. And sometimes I think the lens, we brush it over with too much of a large brush sometimes without spending more time or maybe doing more than one story. Because, college students, we say this all the time, college students in general are not a monolith. Black college students are not. Even at an HBCU, every student does not have the same thought. All women don't feel the same way. And we're learning that with this specific, with Israel-Hamas war, even on our college campus, you have a varied viewpoints. And we've had peace walkouts. We've had incidents at the administration building, which were all peaceful. But we've also been, as was mentioned earlier, at the hot seat in previous years and decades, and the students are known to actively protest. And so for the student journalists, they're accustomed to covering protests, whether it's on or off campus. But I think the media in general should spend a little more time and dig a little deeper and not just run in and run out, because I think sometimes they miss much of the sentiment of what's really happening because they're just doing a day of, oftentimes a couple of hours to cover such a story that has a lot of layers.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I think that it's easy to get into the polarized, this is what one side is doing than the other. I think there's so much complexity, and not to gloss over, like, there are absolutely conflicts, right, on campus, and people do feel afraid to speak out on many different levels. And even myself as a journalism professor, I'm particularly, I can be cautious at times when maybe I might not have been as much before. But sort of the complexity, one of the things that I see that I'm so proud of student journalists, ours and so many, they are engaging in deep, thoughtful discussions about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, impact on communities, that I think newsrooms are engaging with at some level, but it is really a complex decision. For example, our Daily Northwestern board, and dealing, I mean, some of you may or may not know, in summary, some students or people put a false front page on the Daily during the fall, and then the governing student publishing council that oversees and publishes the Daily. It's so complex because it's not the school, it's a publishing company. They filed a complaint, and there ended up being charges, and the Daily protests, actually, the charges that came from the law enforcement, and it's a much more complex story than that. But the engagement and the thought that I know many of those students that they put into talking about all kinds of issues, I know it's hard to get that in a story where you are limited in word count or video, but I'm really impressed with the kinds of dialogue that they are engaged with, both in the journalism world and in the community at large, in their activist community and the other students that protested when this happened, and they were part of that. So anyway, I just would love to, if the coverage were actually really showing the hard work that these students are doing, even whether people view them as right or wrong.
You mentioned interesting, nuanced conversations are happening. I would love if each of you could talk a little bit about some of the thoughts or concerns, questions you are having with your students as they're talking about how to cover these kinds of protests and events.
Sure, I could start on that one. So in the classroom, we'll just use the current one that's taking place, and we had similar conversations during the George Floyd protests, and that might even be a better one for me to use for this example, just because I feel in that case, you're at an HBCU, so many students were very passionate about what they saw happening around them. And the discussions that we had, and we were, all in the virtual modality then because of COVID, but we still were covering the story, regardless of whether they were in Washington or still at home. So the conversations, if I could get that out, became, first you have to talk about how they're feeling, and then discussed, well, how do you cover that with these feelings? And again, a lot of it is what's been said earlier, having that transparency and being able for the students to talk about it. But then you still have to say, okay, you're still covering the story as a journalist. So as a journalist, we talked about, First Amendment, what you should be doing, how if your voice is in there, what does that look like? One thing that a lot of classrooms across the country started facing during this time too was the whole notion of objectivity, and if there's such a thing in reporting. And there was a fallout in many newsrooms around the country, specifically pertaining to Black journalists who were seeing what was happening with George Floyd and didn't feel that the writings with the protests were accurately depicting how many communities of color were feeling. So we were caught up with all of these things going on. And I think for us, one thing that we talked about with covering the story, again, is to stick to what's happening, but being able to put it in context and being able to go beyond just what are the facts, who was arrested, what's happening, but to put it in context to why it matters to certain communities. And of course, the whole George Floyd went around policing and what that looks like and the disparities and the differences. So those are teachable opportunities, not just for students and how to cover it, but in what those stories were to those readers and those watchers who were consuming the information. And I think the same with the current conflict is, knowing that wording is so important. I was at CNN for a number of years, and they actually have gotten some backlash for their coverage of the war right now. But you have to be very careful in how you word support, even when it comes to Roe versus Wade, reproduction rights versus other terms that are used. You have to be careful in the wording because there's a lot in that. And then our proper sourcing for what they're reporting, and then just giving some of the background for how those cases came to be in the first place. And that helps them get into the proper context so that when they go about writing the story, they have a better base from which to start. So I think those things are really important, and they've been really helpful for us. We too, someone had mentioned covering Donald Trump when he came into office. And we had students there in the nation's capital, and we were on campus until, probably 4 a.m. We do all day coverage. And one student went down to the Trump Hotel and was actively there during a protest. And she basically just reported on what she saw. And it was very compelling because you saw both sides as it was happening. And I thought she did a perfect job, and she did well, won some awards from that. But that was a perfect example of being in the midst of something, and you report and show what's happening as the eyes and ears of those who are watching.
Professor Hopgood or Gutterman, do you have any thoughts on that?
Okay, I'll absorb the silence, just like class. It speaks to a broader issue of in class discussions, and how we absorb and counter speech we disagree with. Issues come up on campus, particularly in my classes, about free speech and First Amendment rights, and we have to have clinical discussions about lots of things that may be potentially offensive. And again, the clinical discussion is different from just blathering and just saying inflammatory things for the sake of inflammatory speaking. But how do we deal? And this pops up in some of the cases we talk about in my classes. How do you deal with anti-Semitic speech, like the Nazis marching through Skokie, Illinois in the 70s, or racist speech, or otherwise offensive speech, profanity, certain types of political speech, and again, this is more of an academic viewpoint on this than being in the heat of a fight, but um, more speech and counter speech is a great uh, theory to bring into class. But that all ends when it really hits a nerve, and this is one of those issues that hits a nerve for a lot of people. And you can still have a clinical analytical discussion, but eventually it could get emotional.
I'm going to remind anyone who's watching, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat because I have more, but I don't want to monopolize our panelists. Well, this kind of ties into like the age-old issue journalists face, which is how do you cover a very emotional, nuanced thing without inevitably being accused of taking a side or doing both sidesism? And how do you talk to your students about that?
Something that I often use as an example is I would tell my class, if we were talking about a certain story that they were covering or how they felt about a topic, I remind them that, that's your job is not to report how you feel about the story. Your job is to tell the story. And I always would say, if anyone was watching any of my newscasts, whether I was in local news or on the network level, they would never know who the producer was putting the show together or the executive producer. They wouldn't know, what my gender was. They wouldn't know what I looked like, who I believed in, where I worshiped, because it's not about me. It's about telling the story, the various sides of the story, and letting those who have opinions voice those opinions. And, always stand behind that and stand behind your work. And while that, may sound like pie in the sky, it's true. And I think now because of social media, the students today are they're very involved. They're much more involved than we probably give them credit to be. But because of social media, not all of the information that they're getting is accurate. So a lot of times they're reacting as their classmates are to something they see online or what they're hearing. So it's important for them to really understand the context again on the issues that they're reporting about before we send them out into the streets and to tell the story. And I just always say separate yourself so that when you're reporting, no one will necessarily know who you are. Now, there may be an instance where that is not possible. And if that's the case, if you're talking about a disparity in a community or a neighborhood, and you are doing a story from a neighborhood where you grew up, well, then that's a case where maybe your context in that story helps explain it without seeming that you're biased in telling it. I think that that's okay and it's possibly helpful, but it really depends on what the story is. But yes, take yourself out, report, and be that lens for people to see on the broadcast side. That's something that I mentioned to my capstone and journalism ethics students.
I think a lot of the discussions for me, it's partly about because my journalism has been what probably it falls more in line with the way the students think about objectivity and subjectivity. I do talk a lot about identity of coming into almost every single class. And because the students, many of students have many different identities and they bring them very forward in class. And I think it helps us frame the world and journalism and stakeholders in a true way that doesn't say, oh, put that away. And I think that it's important to recognize those things. I think all of us probably do not teach objectivity as we might have learned in journalism school at all. It's
What do you mean by that?
I think I mean, personally myself, the idea there's an objective journalist or there's an objective journalism, I never believed that. And I think perhaps we can debate over the objective journalism process, but I think I myself knew I was always different in journalism, knew I brought a perspective, knew that there were perspectives that were not being uplifted. And I knew that quite frankly, the white male perspective in newsrooms was the dominating objective voice or objective method. So I myself even being young and even at the time we were learning that, the idea, I thought about it. I try, we always want to challenge our views and our experience and be open and listen and actively listen but I think that students really push hard on that now. And it's more kind of a critical eye to what that means and how to be fair and how to make sure we're bringing in different stakeholders and viewpoints and really listening and engaging people that we cover. So I'm sorry, I don't mean to be blabbery, but I do feel like students come with a different base, very much like Professor Thomas says, a different base in many things, in objectivity and subjectivity, who gets to cover what, and social media. I mean, I think students come in being able to report for an audience from birth almost, right? So they have definitely a capacity of engaging technology and thinking about an audience and presenting a story. Now, whether that's journalism or not, but anyway, I think that it's just such a different conversation with people who are coming into college now, whether it's undergrads or graduates, about identity, about objectivity and subjectivity, about technology.
I would just add to that sometimes we have to remind people to keep those firm lines in place. And I think there's a sizable portion of younger journalists and journalism students who don't have a problem opining on things or blurring the line between activism and journalism. And in some ways, I think the media itself is partially to blame for that. When you can watch, 10 hours at night of political rhetoric being passed along is under the auspices of news with a bunch of talking heads. And, many people don't make the distinction between a panel of talking heads on a so-called news channel and objective on the ground reporting. And I think that's part of the problem. And I think that's permeated some of what our students are dealing with, that they don't think it's a big deal to have an opinion on an issue and to tailor their stories that way. And I mean, I find that extremely troubling. Personally, I'm glad I don't have to cover these sorts of issues that I have a personal belief in. I was lucky when I was a reporter. I covered a big suburban city outside of Cleveland that I did not live in. I did not have a dog in the fight in anything that happened in that city. And I was really happy that I didn't have that. And the few statewide or national issues that I covered, a couple international issues, I had to mute my personal opinions because that's what I was trained to do. And I never wanted my reporting to be questioned by a taint of bias. And I tried to operate that way. And just, one of the last things the city manager of the city I covered said to me before I left the newspaper to go to law school, he said, I didn't always agree with all your stories, but I knew you'd always be fair. And that meant a lot to me because, I didn't always make this guy look like a great guy, and he was a decent manager, but it's politics, it's public affairs, it's taxpayer money at stake, and I had important stories for that community to cover, and nobody, people didn't always agree with it, but they always got a fair shake, which I was happy with.
I
You
just wanted
mentioned,
to add, oh, I'm sorry.
oh, you go ahead.
I was just going to add to what Professor Gunneman said, and I think the key here is the being fair part. I think that you can look at so many stories where I think sometimes those personal opinions, everyone has an opinion, and it shapes who we are. And I think that the students today, as was previously mentioned, they come bringing all of that. And I do completely agree that there are so many blurred lines now with opinion-based news reporting, and it confuses not just the audience and the consumers, but the students who are being trained to see people and they say, I want to be like that person. But, those people, are in their positions, they have a name by their show or their column. So that's what they're there to do. And that's what they get paid to do. And I think we're starting to see a return of a lot of the legacy and cable news networks that are going back to what the job is to be in the first place, is to inform. And we're seeing more on reporting on the issues, which is what I was just going to follow up with, is that I think it's okay. So for example, when we talked about, I'll just say George Floyd again, I shared with my students that at age 16, I was pulled over leaving a football game in my dance team cheering uniform at gunpoint by police. No questions were asked. I had my hands up. I didn't know what was going on. It was extremely traumatizing for that. So now how would I use that if I were a reporter telling the story? So when you tell the story about arrest and why communities are upset, well, then you do the example that would be someone that was like me. Why is this troubling? And then we've also had conversations. Well, how many students have a parent who is a police officer? Well, what about, how is it for that person in the story? I think it's important that we remember as journalists to bring that human element to our storytelling. And that puts context into the story and the complexities of what these issues are. And I think if we, remember to put the people back in the stories and just stop, these are the facts, these are the facts, these are the facts. I think that makes people more compassionate and understanding. You may not agree, but you understand. I've had friends that, where I started in Alabama who've covered the Klan who were Black, but, they had a perspective and they, were assigned the story. And we see that a lot. So I think it's possible to still use your personal experiences in ways that channel perhaps some of the storytelling techniques that you would use.
The question I was going to ask was along those same lines as what Professor Thomas was just talking about, but each of you have said that on your respective campuses, students have this kind of differing opinion of how to do journalism than what probably each of us learned, which is, I think Professor Gutterman just said, when I was covering things, I was told to keep not have a vested stake or show what I believe in reporting. And so a lot of students don't feel that way now, or feel that that's wrong, that like suppressing parts of your identity is not the way we should be doing things. So I'm not asking you to say whether or not you agree that's true, but I am curious what your thoughts are when students are challenging you on inserting their opinions into the stories they're covering.
Maybe that raises a philosophical question that ethicists deal with all the time. Can you ever truly be objective? I'm not an ethicist. I'm not a I don't have any additional knowledge about how the human mind works, but we make editorial decisions all the time with word choices and sourcing, and I don't know if we can ever fully eliminate implicit bias, um, but we can try to recognize it and perhaps do the best that we can to counter it. But I mean, maybe one of my colleagues here has a better answer to that.
So I'm like in the middle of grading season and editing like drafts upon drafts. I think I'm doing this all the time. I guess one thing I would add to, again, what my colleague said is, because I agree with all of it, is sort of the issue of transparency. And I do think there is a place for certain kind of journalism that can be whatever it's called, advocacy journalism, or that comes from a certain audience or viewpoint. I think that's just the landscape that exists, but are we being transparent about what we're doing? It is an important question that I have for students when they want to report on climate change and they have very strong views, or even like when they come at like things like gentrification and sort of introducing the idea of complexity and the question of gentrification, because they love to go to neighborhoods and be outraged with the idea. But then I'm like, well, how about resident views that want economic viability and jobs in their neighborhoods? So, I mean, it's more of like a very specific conversation with students and their stories about, or when we analyze stories about the complexity, going back to the of stories. And I would say, like, talking about complexity, asking students to be transparent, and kind of giving opportunities for students to elevate their voices, but also to balance out or be fair when they do that. I have students that say, I didn't know I could write about my experience in my neighborhood. And I think that it shouldn't be the only thing they do, for sure. And they should be like challenging their own experience in their own neighborhood, but giving them the opportunity to tell those stories too, and to share those stories, I think is valuable in sort of creating the discussion around these sorts of issues. Your viewpoint in a story, your point of view. What other things do we need to explore?
And I agree. And I agree with everything that's been said. I think the only thing I would add is that, so similarly to what Professor Hopkins just said, we talk about, so for my capstone students, they're broadcast and they put together newscasts, and they use all the content that they've covered over the course of the semester. So one of the last ones we say, okay, what is your newscast going to look like? And I let them, we have the news meeting, they go up the board, they list all the stories that they've covered, and whether they're feature, looking at depression, climate change, as was said. And, interestingly enough, every class ends up with a newscast that you might see anywhere else. They're covering the big stories. Last semester, it was the Israeli-Hamas war, and, telling the story, telling the facts. And then as they go through the other topics, it's those same stories that you might watching the evening news, but the difference is the lens that it's told under. So they may tell the headline, and then there's a perspective of their community that may not be told. And was mentioned, like gentrification is a great example. We're in the middle of Washington, D.C., it's completely gentrified. The neighborhoods where our university is, half of us can't afford to live there now. But then look at the resources. So, taking those deeper dive, nuanced looks for all of our outlets on campus, I think is what our responsibility should be in terms of helping to change and to train our journalists.
Right. I'm curious if you have any advice for journalists who might be watching this webinar who want to feature more student voices in their reporting. How can they thoughtfully interact with students and kind of gain trust to talk to them about things that are really complicated and maybe scary to talk about? I can be a college professor and call a name.
I'll just say very quickly so everyone else can speak. I think what's important, because we get that a lot of people will run to our campus just to grab a story, as we talked about a little earlier. And I would say if you're that education reporter, don't just throw a microphone in front of a student, and don't go onto that college campus without doing your research. And just researching not just the story itself, possibly the student body, who's it comprised of, just some of those basics as you would do with any other story that you're going to cover. Because college campus students, I mean, they have the gamut, they may have been students who are there. We talked in class the other day, students that may have gone to boarding school versus students who may have been homeless. You don't know what, there's not one college experience. There's not one college student, regardless of where you are, and there are varied views. So know that, I think, going in, and don't just, we always say get, 2 or more sources. Don't just go and get one soundbite or one interview. Talk to enough students so you feel you have a good sampling of the student body that you're going to report on. Otherwise, it does seem like your story, that you haven't done your due diligence. And I would say do your due diligence on a college campus like you would anywhere else.
I like one of my favorite assignments lately has been kind of a slow reporting or slow conversations assignment to students, where they go and actually just kind of hang out in neighborhoods or places and talk to people about what they think about the media and what they think the stories should be, and before the actual interviews begin. And I know surely all the journalists that would listen to this have all kinds of time to go hang around with some students. But I mean, it would be a lovely idea to spend some time with students, to go to campuses, to engage in a kind of just a human interaction. It would be awesome in my world too, to have that role model of actually journalists interacting and helping people, not just journalism students, right? One of the biggest things I have is our need to media literacy on campus generally, and understand what a journalist does. It would be great if people can hang around, but I know that's just not a realistic, but they definitely have, there's lots of student gatherings and lots of places that students get together to talk about stuff. So I'm sure the journalists engaging with this are doing some of that.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, it all boils down to time. If your editor or station manager gives you an assignment, and you have an hour to report it and put it together, well, you're going to get what you're going to get at that level. So, if you are in one of those situations where you're going to have very little time to do the reporting, to hang around, or to do the kind of in-depth sourcing that you would have for an enterprise piece, the alternative to that is knowing your community, knowing your beat, knowing the right people. In the old days, used to call it having a good Rolodex. Now it's probably having a lot of good contacts, and an ability to find the right contacts on deadline. So they're different skill sets that we need, and perhaps maybe even a little more leniency by the people assigning the stories, to give the people and reporters on the ground the time to interview those 20 people for the story, so you can pull the right material. But we rarely have that luxury. So it all depends on the type of story and how good you are at what you're going to have to do.
And maybe I'll just add one last thing. Maybe, just like we tell our students, if they're going to go cover something, look and see what the campus media has done on the topic, if anything. That's just gives you a good basis. We always look, and see what other stories are out there when students are, finish their pieces, and see what else has been reported. Or it's just like doing any other assignment where you're having to watch the news. See what the student journalists at that university, how they've covered the story, just to give you some insight, as you would do before you run to a neighborhood that you may have heard about. reacting on any other story.
Well, we are almost at the end of our time. I would turn it over to each of you to say if there's anything you think we didn't get to touch on that you'd like our attendees to know, go for it. And before we say that, I just want to thank EWA for convening this conversation to begin with. Any farewell thoughts? Well, if not, I guess I will turn it over to Steph Smith.
Thank you so much. And first, just let me say, so sorry for my technological problems getting on here. It was a little bit difficult. I'm thrilled to have joined the webinar, and I am so happy you all are here lending us your time and your expertise. And again, as you know, this has been recorded. I think this is going to be watched a lot by people who clearly are in class or at work today, and it's an incredibly busy time for many people. But these webinars live a long life online, and I think this will be very helpful to journalists figuring out what is the climate on college campuses. How do I go about reporting there about what's going on in terms of campus speech right now, and what are campus journalists doing that could teach me how to do my job better, and what voices should be centered and elevated. So thank you for your thoughtful and nuanced conversation. Truly appreciate it. And I look forward to an ongoing discussion on this. And Kaylee, thank you so much for being a terrific moderator. I truly appreciate everything Professor Hopgood, Professor Gutterman, and Professor Thomas. It was very instructive. So with that, I hope you all go have a good lunch.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice meeting you all.
Yes, sir.